It's 1953. You've just finished fighting in what historians will later call one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. You've watched your friends die on frozen mountain ridges. You've marched through mud that wanted to swallow you whole. You've done things you'd rather not remember. And now, finally, the guns are silent. The fighting has stopped. So you pack up your things. You shake hands with the enemy you've been trying to kill for 3 years. You go home. And then, nothing happens. No celebration. No victory parade. No formal end. No peace treaty. Your country is still technically at war, and it will be for the next 70 plus years. And you'll pass that war down to your grandchildren. And their grandchildren. That's not a movie plot. That's not some dystopian novel. That is literally happening right now, on this very day, on a peninsula in East Asia. This is the Korean War. And technically, it never ended. Welcome to What Is. Today we're going to unpack one of the most misunderstood conflicts in modern history, a war that shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire 20th century and continues to define international relations today. A war that most Americans can't actually tell you much about, despite it being the site of some of the most ferocious fighting the world has ever seen. We're going to answer the question, what exactly was the Korean War? And why is it still technically ongoing today? Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's do this. Context and background. To understand the Korean War, we need to go back further than 1950. We need to understand how Korea went from one country to two countries. And that story starts with heartbreak, colonization, and a world war that changed everything. For over 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, Korea was under Japanese rule. The Japanese colonizers, let's call them what they were not gentle rulers. They suppressed Korean language, Korean culture, Korean identity. They forced people to adopt Japanese names. They took land from farmers. They worked people in factories and mines under brutal conditions. They committed atrocities that, frankly, the world didn't pay enough attention to at the time. Korea was a colony. Its people were subjects. And they hated it. Every Korean you meet whose family lived through that period carries that trauma. It's not ancient history. There are still people alive today who remember the Japanese flag flying over Seoul, who remember being told they were not Korean, but subjects of the emperor. That matters. That context matters. Then came World War II. In 1945, the Japanese Empire collapsed. The atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the desperate final battles, it all came crashing down in August of 1945. And suddenly, Korea was free. Or was it? Here's where things get complicated. When Japan surrendered, the Korean peninsula was divided. Not by Korea, by the Allies. You see, the US and the Soviet Union had agreed, in the closing days of the war, to accept the Japanese surrender north and south of the 38th parallel. The Americans would take the south, the Soviets would take the north. The 38th parallel, an imaginary line drawn on a map by two American military officers with a ruler and a map, became the border that would split a nation in two. Think about that for a second. A line drawn with a ruler. No consideration of geography, of families, of ethnicity, of culture. Just a line that would split a people who had shared a language, a history, and identity for over 1,000 years. And here's where I have to be careful, because if there's one thing that gets historians riled up, it's when you oversimplify the Cold War. But here's the basic truth. The US and the Soviet Union, those two massive superpowers, had very different visions for what Korea should become. The US wanted a free, democratic South Korea, a buffer against communism spreading in Asia. The Soviets wanted a communist North Korea, a Soviet ally, a buffer against American influence. And so, over the next few years, two governments formed. In the South, the US helped establish the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In the North, the Soviets helped establish the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as its first premier. One country, two governments, two ideologically opposed superpowers backing each side. And everyone knew this couldn't last forever. The outbreak of war, June 25th, 1950. Most Americans had never heard of Korea. It wasn't in the news. It wasn't a priority. The war in Europe was 5 years over. The war in Japan was over. People wanted to move on, to enjoy peace, to forget about the last 15 years of global chaos. North Korea had crossed the border. 6 divisions, around 90,000 troops, moved south in a massive coordinated assault. They had Soviet tanks. They had Soviet advisors. They had the element of surprise. And they were coming fast. The South Korean army, undermanned, under-equipped, still rebuilding from colonial days, was overrun almost immediately. Towns fell, then cities, then the capital, Seoul, fell less than 3 days after the invasion. The world watched in shock. The US, which had essentially created South Korea and promised to protect it, had been caught completely off guard. President Truman, in the White House, made one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. The US would intervene. This was not just about Korea. This was about containing communism. This was about showing the world that the US would stand up to Soviet expansion. This was about the domino theory before it even had a name. And here's a fun fact. Well, fun might be the wrong word. But here's something that surprises most people. The US almost didn't send ground troops to Korea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually recommended using only air and naval power. It was the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who convinced Truman that air and naval power alone wouldn't be enough. Ground troops were necessary. So think about that. The next time you see those grainy black and white footage of US Marines storming up those hills, that almost didn't happen. The entire course of the war, the hundreds of thousands of deaths, almost played out completely differently. The UN Security Council, with the Soviet Union boycotting at the time over a different issue, a story for another video, passed a resolution calling for member nations to help South Korea. 16 countries would eventually send troops, but it was the US that carried the bulk of the fighting. And what fighting it was. If you're enjoying this dive into the Korean War, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And my ego too. Let's get back to the war. The war, inside major events. The Korean War was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the neat, clean, conventional war that military planners had imagined. It was brutal, chaotic, and at times completely insane. Let me give you the quick tour of the major phases. Phase 1, the retreat and the Pusan perimeter. In those first months, the North Koreans pushed all the way down to the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. The UN forces, primarily American, were pushed into a tiny corner around the port city of Pusan. It looked honestly like they might be pushed into the sea. The North Koreans had the momentum. They had the numbers, they had the tanks. But then came the amphibious landing at Incheon. Incheon, September 15th, 1950. General Douglas MacArthur, in one of the most daring military maneuvers in history, landed troops behind enemy lines, miles from the main fighting, in a port city with some of the most difficult tidal conditions in the world. The tides there vary by 30 feet. The beaches are mudflats. The intelligence people said it couldn't be done. MacArthur did it anyway, and it worked brilliantly. The North Korean forces, stretched thin and overextended, collapsed. The UN forces broke out of Pusan, recaptured Seoul, and pushed north, all the way north, past the 38th parallel, toward the Yalu River. The Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. And that's when things went sideways. Phase 2, Chinese intervention. China, freshly victorious in its own civil war, was not about to let American troops on its border. Mao Zedong, whose forces had just completed their own long march to power, saw the UN forces approaching and decided, enough. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer troops crossed the Yalu River and hit the UN forces like a freight train. The 1st Marine Division, the US Army's 1st Cavalry Division, The British troops, the Turkish brigade, everyone got hit. The UN forces were pushed back. Seoul changed hands again. The war entered a new nightmare phase. And here's something that always blows people's minds. The Chinese troops didn't have the kind of equipment you'd expect. They were vastly outgunned in terms of firepower. What they had was numbers and sacrifice. They would march at night without lights, without sound, in complete silence, and then attack at dawn. The first the UN forces knew they were there was when the bullets started flying. There are veterans of the Korean War who still talk about the sound, the bugles, the horns, the shouting, charging across open ground into machine gun fire. It was wave after wave after wave. It was horrifying. It was effective. Phase 3. The stalemate. By 1951, the war had settled into a brutal, grinding stalemate. Both sides dug in along a line that would become famous, the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. Both sides had powerful air support. Both sides had massive artillery. Both sides had learned, the hard way, that neither was going to win a total victory. The war became a war of attrition. It became a war of outposts and hills. It became a war of patrols and night raids. It became a war where men froze to death on mountain peaks and drowned in rice paddies and got blown apart by artillery fire that came from nowhere. And it went on, and on, and on. The armistice. Why the war never ended. July 27th, 1953. That's the date that matters. That's the date the fighting stopped. After 2 years of negotiations, yes, 2 years, while the fighting continued, the two sides signed an armistice agreement. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. What's the difference? Great question. A peace treaty formally ends a war. It declares victory and defeat or mutual understanding. It establishes permanent peace. An armistice is a ceasefire. It's an agreement to stop fighting, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the underlying conflict. And that is the key to understanding why the Korean War is technically still ongoing. When the armistice was signed in 1953, it created a demilitarized zone, a narrow strip of land, about 2.5 miles wide, running across the Korean peninsula, roughly along the 38th parallel. It established a ceasefire. It created mechanisms for monitoring the ceasefire. It allowed for the exchange of prisoners. But it did not, I cannot stress this enough, it did not create a peace treaty. Both Koreas, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, were created as separate entities. Neither ever recognized the other as legitimate. Neither ever signed a document saying, okay, we're one country now, or okay, we're two countries, and we're fine with that. The armistice was an agreement between the UN forces, the North Koreans, and the Chinese, but it was not a treaty between two sovereign nations. And here's the kicker. North Korea never signed the armistice. Let me explain. The armistice was signed by General William Harrison Jr. for the UN command, by General Nam Il for the Korean People's Army, and by General Peng Dehuai for the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. But the actual document was not signed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That was a legal technicality that in some ways remains a point of contention to this day. So technically, from a legal standpoint, the North Korean government never technically agreed to stop fighting, which is one way to look at it, I guess. The result? For 71 years, the two Koreas have been in a state of neither war nor peace. There's a ceasefire, but not a peace. There's a border, but not a recognized international boundary. There's tension, but not active combat. And that matters. It matters enormously, because it means the Korean War was never really resolved. It was paused, and that pause has lasted longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. The current situation. So what does this mean today? What does technically still ongoing actually look like on the ground? Here's what it looks like. The DMZ is one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. There are over 1 million troops stationed between the two Koreas. There are minefields, razor wire, watch tanks, artillery positions, and patrol routes. There are tunnels, multiple tunnels dug by North Korea into the south, discovered over the years, that were clearly intended for invasion. There are defection attempts, people fleeing North Korea, risking everything to cross the DMZ or the northern border into China. There are family separations, families split between North and South who haven't seen each other in 70 years. There are provocations, North Korean nuclear tests, missile launches, military drills that simulate attacks on the South. There are responses, joint military exercises between the US and South Korea, enhanced missile defense systems, economic sanctions. And there are the summits, the historic meetings between leaders, the handshake across the border, the hopeful moments of diplomacy that always seem to hit a wall. Here's a strange detail that puts things in perspective. There are still US troops in South Korea. Not a few, about 28,500 US military personnel are stationed there, permanently. Their grandchildren are now serving in the same places their grandparents served. There are service members who are third-generation Korean War veterans. Their grandfather served in the war, their father was stationed in Korea during the Cold War, and now they're there today. That's not a historical footnote, that's ongoing history. The Korean War never officially ended because a peace treaty was never signed. The underlying issues were never resolved. The division was never healed. And today, as we speak, North Korea is a nuclear power. And that changes everything about how this still ongoing conflict could potentially play out. This is not just history. This is the present. This is the future. Okay, I know this is heavy stuff. War, division, nuclear tensions. It's a lot to take in. But before we wrap up, I want to take a quick break and remind you why this matters. Why you're watching this video. Why you're learning about a war that ended 70 years ago, but never officially ended. This matters because it shapes the world you live in. The Korean War is the reason the US has military bases scattered across Asia. It's the reason South Korea and the US are such close allies. It's the reason Japan rearmed and became a military power, something that country hadn't done since World War II. It's the reason the Cold War got so hot in Asia. It's the reason your tax dollars go to defense spending in ways you might not realize. It's also the reason we have the tension we have today, with North Korea threatening tests, with Kim Jong-un making announcements, with the world watching nervously. So if you've learned something, if this has been valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't, join the What Is community, and stick around because we're about to wrap up with why this all matters and a special bonus fact at the end. Let's go. Why it matters today. The Korean War matters because it's not over. That's the simplest way to say it. That's the most important thing to understand. This is not a history lesson about something that happened and ended. This is a live situation, an ongoing conflict that has been frozen in time for 71 years, but could unfreeze at any moment. Think about that. The last time someone fired a shot in anger along the DMZ, Barack Obama was in middle school. The last time a soldier died in combat, Ronald Reagan was president. That's how long this ceasefire has held. But it's not permanent. It was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a pause, a breather, a chance to negotiate a peace. And those negotiations never happened. So why should you care? Why should you, watching this in whatever year you come across this video, care about a war that most history classes rush through in about 15 minutes? Because the Korean War is a window into how fragile peace really is. Because it shows how easily a line on a map can become a wall that lasts forever. Because it demonstrates how quickly the world can change, from peace to chaos to stalemate to a kind of frozen conflict that no one knows how to end. Because your life, your economic life, your security, your world, is shaped by decisions made in 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953, by people you've never heard of, in places you've never been to, in a war that most people have forgotten. The Korean War matters because we are living in its aftermath. We have always been living in its aftermath. And unless something changes, unless a peace treaty is signed, unless the two Koreas find a way to coexist, unless the world finds a way to resolve the underlying tensions, we will continue to live in its aftermath. That's why you should care. That's why this matters. That's why we're talking about it today. And that's the Korean War. What it was, why it happened, and why it's still technically ongoing. If you found this video valuable, if you learned something, if this changed how you think about the world, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What did you find most surprising? What do you want to learn more about? What other conflicts or historical events should we cover? Subscribe to What Is if you haven't already. Hit the bell to get notified when we post new videos. And if you want more content like this, more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, we're just getting started. Before we go, here's that bonus fact I promised. Bonus fact. Here's a fact about the Korean War that even most history buffs don't know. There was a point during the war where the US seriously considered using nuclear weapons, not once, but multiple times. In 1953, as the war was grinding to a halt, President Eisenhower, who had himself been a general in World War II, considered using atomic weapons to break the stalemate. The idea was floated at high-level meetings. The Joint Chiefs of Staff actually discussed targeting North Korean cities with nuclear weapons. In the end, it was decided not to use them, partly because of the Chinese threat, partly because of Soviet nuclear capabilities, partly because of international backlash. But the fact that it was considered, that nuclear weapons were on the table in a war that killed millions, is a reminder of how close the world came to something even more catastrophic. And that is something to think about the next time you hear about tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.